The late light was dying, stretching long and thin across the dusty street. It made the shadows of the town look like graves, and there, on the church steps, stood a little girl, maybe 6 years old, barefoot. Her arms were shaking, but not from the cold. She was holding two babies, two tiny infants wrapped in rags, and they were squirming like captured things. Behind her, crumpled against the stone wall of the church, a woman lay broken. You could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest. You could see the tear in her dress, right at the ribs, where someone had tried to break her soul. The town was dead quiet. Shutters were drawn, doors were bolted. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a whole town agrees to look away from another family's sorrow. But the little girl wasn't looking away. She stood her ground like a tiny soldier. Then came the sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate. A cowboy on a tired horse, reins slack in one hand, hat brim pulled low against the last of the sun. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped in towns like this. He was the kind of man who passed through. But something about the silence, something about that tiny soldier on the steps, it pulled at him. It made him stop. He swung down, tied his horse to the fence, and his boots made no sound in the thick dust. He got closer. The girl lifted her chin. Her face was a strange mix of fear and pure, uncut defiance. "Mister," she said. Her voice was raw, but it was steady. "They broke Mama's ribs. She can't feed my brothers no more." She held the babies out a little further. "Will you help us?" The cowboy felt the air leave his lungs. He'd seen hunger. He'd seen men do terrible things to women, but he'd never seen the truth laid so bare by a mouth so small. He crouched down to her level. His hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard work, were trembling. He reached for one of the infants, and its cry was so thin it was barely there. More a question than a protest. His thumb brushed the baby's cheek, and a tear, hot and unwelcome, stung his eye. Just then, the church door creaked open. The preacher stepped out. He was a tall man, weary with the weight of scripture in his bones. He took in the whole scene with one sad look. He knelt by the mother, feeling for the faint pulse in her neck. "Suffer the little children to come unto me," he murmured, his voice thick with a sorrow that felt ancient. The cowboy lifted the infant, cradling it against his leather vest. The warmth of the tiny body felt both strange and terribly familiar. "Where's your kin, girl?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She shook her head. "Ain't got none, just Mama." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She tried keeping us hid, but they found her." That last word, her, it shivered on its way out. The cowboy closed his eyes, just for a second. But in that second, he saw another woman, pale in a birthing bed. He saw another child that never drew a breath. His silence wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. When he opened his eyes, he looked at the girl with something like an oath. "Somebody's got to do right by you," he whispered. It was a promise to her, and to the ghosts. The preacher pressed a hand to the mother's forehead, praying, "Lord, bind up the wounded, pour oil upon their hurts." The girl clutched the other baby tighter. Her thin arms were shaking worse now. "Mister," she said, suspicion creeping into her voice. "You ain't going to take us away, are you? Folks say men like you trade things." She looked down at her brother. "Mama said we weren't made for trade." The cowboy's jaw went tight. His voice was low and hard as iron. "No, child, some things ain't meant for trade, not ever." He looked around. The sun was gone. The air was getting thick with the smell of wood smoke from chimneys he couldn't see. A single bell tolled in the distance, then silence. He met the girl's gaze. He could see terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a tiny flicker of trust was trying to catch fire. "Help me get your mama inside," he said. The preacher nodded, pushing the heavy church door all the way open. Together they lifted the broken woman. She was light, too light. Her face was pale as a bone in the moonlight. The girl followed close behind. Her brothers clutched to her chest, whispering a lullaby that sounded too old for her. Inside, the church smelled of old wax and pine boards and 1,000 forgotten prayers. They laid the mother on a pew. The preacher lit a few lanterns, and the light threw long, dancing shadows across the altar. The girl sat on the floor, rocking the babies, her song a tiny thread of sound in the vast, silent dark. The cowboy just stood there, hat in his hands, throat tight. He'd ridden into this town a stranger. He'd planned on being gone by morning. But now he felt a rope around his heart, and the other end was in the hands of this little girl and her broken family. He had to see them through the night. He had to. He looked at the girl and finally spoke. "I'll see you through this night. You and them boys, and your mama." The preacher heard him and gave a slow, solemn nod. The girl looked up, and for the first time, a little bit of the hardness left her face. "Thank you, mister," she whispered. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the windows. And in the darkness, you could hear voices. Murmuring. Townsfolk, drawn out by the scent of trouble, their shadows stretching long and ugly in the lamplight spilling from the church. The cowboy turned toward the door. His hand didn't move to his gun. Not yet. But it rested close, a silent promise that he was ready to stand between this small pocket of innocence and all the cruelty in the world. The night was long and cold. Dawn came up pale and grey, and the church was still quiet. The woman was still breathing, the girl was still holding her brothers, and the cowboy was still there. His horse was waiting, but the trail would have to wait too. Some things you ride away from, some things you have to stay and face. By midday, the whispers started. They drifted through town like dry leaves. Folks would walk past the church, slow down, and stare. They saw the stranger, his big shoulders hunched over the infants, and they didn't see mercy. They saw scandal. "Shameful," a woman at the general store muttered, "taking in a woman like that." The cowboy heard it all, but he had to get them out of there. The preacher brought bread and a little milk. The cowboy crouched and helped the girl dip a strip of cloth into the milk for the babies. His large, scarred hands were surprisingly gentle as he steadied her small ones. The girl watched him, her eyes full of questions. "You ain't going to leave us here, are you?" He shook his head. "No, child, but this ain't no place for you." He told her about his cabin, a ways out of town, quiet, safe. Suspicion flared in her eyes again. "Mama said not to trust no strangers." The cowboy managed a sad smile. She was right, but sometimes even a stranger aims to do right. "I won't harm you, that's my word." The preacher put a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Trust him, little one, this is mercy." She hesitated. You could see the war going on behind her eyes. But then she gave a slow, trembling nod. By afternoon, the cowboy had a wagon, borrowed from the preacher. They laid the mother in the back on a thick bed of blankets. The girl sat beside her, clutching the twins, her eyes darting toward the faces that gathered on corners to watch them leave. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. Man taking her in like that. Those poor children. The cowboy kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set like stone against their poison. The trail out of town was long and wound through fields of dry, brittle grass. Just as dusk began to settle, they saw it. A small cabin, humble and weathered, with a chimney that leaned just a little, like an old man tired of standing straight. Inside, it was clean. It smelled of pine and wood ash. He laid the woman on his own bed, pulling the quilts up tight around her. The girl stood in the doorway, still holding on to her brothers, her small face a mask of uncertainty. "You can set 'em down," he said gently. "Ain't no harm will come to them here." She just shook her head. "If I let go, they'll be took." He didn't push. Instead, he built a fire. The flames caught, and a warm orange glow filled the small room. He heated some milk in a tin cup and handed it to her. "You feed 'em. Your hands will do better than mine." She looked surprised, but she took the cup. Slowly, carefully, she fed her brothers. And as they drank, you could see the tension leave her shoulders, just a little. "Why you helping us?" she asked, her voice sharp. He looked into the fire, and the flames danced in his eyes. "Maybe I ain't like most folks," he said. It wasn't much of an answer, but she let it be. Night fell. The mother tossed in a fevered sleep, muttering words no one could understand. The cowboy sat by the fire, mending a broken chair. The rhythmic tap of his hammer was a steady, comforting sound in the quiet cabin. The girl watched him. She watched the way his hands moved, sure and steady. She watched the way he'd stop and look over at her mother, a look of deep concern on his face, and the suspicion in her eyes began to wear thin. Finally, her own eyes heavy with sleep, she leaned her head against the wall. "You don't feel like a stranger no more," she whispered, so soft he almost didn't hear it. The cowboy's hammer stopped. He looked at her, then back at the fire. His voice was low and it sounded a little broken. "Reckon I don't feel like one neither," he said. For one night in that small cabin, the fire held back the darkness. But as the girl drifted off to sleep, a shadow crossed the cowboy's face. He knew. He knew this fragile peace they had found wouldn't last. The world was right outside his door, and it was full of whispers and judgment. And he had a feeling it was coming for them. The first few nights in the cabin were quiet. Too quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of the woman's breathing. She drifted in and out of a fever dream, and when she was awake, her eyes were full of fear. The girl never left her side. She hummed old songs and rocked the twins, her small face a perfect picture of worry. The cowboy was a silent guardian. He kept the fire going, he chopped wood, he made sure the shutters were latched tight against the wind. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. His presence was enough. On the third night, the mother's fever broke. Her eyes opened, and for the first time they were clear. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her ribs made her gasp and fall back against the pillows. "Don't let him take my babies," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. The girl took her hand. "Mama, we're safe. He ain't going to let no one take us." But the woman's eyes darted to the cowboy, and they were filled with a deep, bitter suspicion. "No one gives without wanting something back," she said. The cowboy didn't answer. He just kept tending the fire. He knew those words didn't come from him. They came from a long line of men who had taken and left nothing but bruises behind. Later, when the woman was asleep again, the girl came and sat by the hearth. She watched him for a long time. "Mama says folks don't do nothing for free," she said. "Is that true?" He met her gaze. His own eyes were full of old shadows. "Maybe it's true of most," he said, "but not all." "Why not you?" she pressed. He stared into the flames, and for a moment he was 1,000 miles away. "Once had a wife," he said, his voice rough. "She died trying to bring me a child. I reckon I've been walking empty ever since." He looked at the girl. "Ain't looking to take nothing from you, just trying to give back what I lost." The girl was quiet. She could see the pain in his face, the things he wasn't saying. "So you ain't gonna trade us?" she asked, her voice small. He shook his head. "Not in this life or the next." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters like an angry fist. In the days that followed, the woman began to heal, her body at least. Her spirit was still broken. She would wake in the night, crying, whispering about the men who had hurt her, about how she wasn't worth the trouble. The cowboy never asked her what happened. He just kept fixing things. He patched the roof, he mended a broken fence. He showed her with every swing of his hammer that she was worth the work. The girl saw it all, and a tiny seed of hope began to grow in her heart. One evening, the preacher came to visit. He brought a basket with broth and bread. He prayed over the woman, his voice filled with a fierce compassion. "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." When he was done, he looked at the cowboy. "A man can't mend all the world's sorrows, but he can choose one place to set his strength. Seems you've chosen yours." The cowboy just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. After the preacher left, the woman opened her eyes. She looked straight at the cowboy. "Why are you still here?" she asked. There was no suspicion in her voice now, only wonder. He met her gaze. "Because leaving ain't in me anymore," he said simply. Tears filled her eyes. She turned her face to the wall. "I ain't worth saving," she whispered. The cowboy got up and gently pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "Reckon that's for the Lord to say, not you," he said. "And as far as I'm concerned, you're worth every breath he left in you." The girl was watching them, her own eyes shining with tears. She looked from her mother to the cowboy, and the hope in her heart bloomed. "Then maybe," she whispered, "maybe we can stay." The cowboy didn't answer. He sat back down by the fire and started whittling a small piece of wood. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding, because outside in the darkness he heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground. Someone was out there, watching, listening. The town was a place of mud and whispers. Every time the cowboy rode in for supplies, the stairs followed him like hungry dogs. They didn't see a man buying flour and lamp oil. They saw a man living in sin. They saw a woman with no name and children with no future. At the mercantile, the gossip was as thick as the dust on the shelves. "She ain't respectable," one woman said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "And him," said another, "letting her drag him down into the gutter." The cowboy heard it all. He felt his knuckles turn white as he gripped the counter. But he said nothing. He just paid for his things and walked back out into the street, where the judgment felt cold enough to freeze a man's blood. Back at the cabin, the girl knew something was wrong. "Folks don't like us, do they?" she asked. He crouched down in front of her. "Don't you ever let the world tell you what you're worth," he said, his voice low and fierce. "The Lord made you precious." From the bed, the mother's voice was thin and brittle. "They're right to whisper. I've been nothing but trouble." Shame was a poison, and it was killing her faster than any broken ribs. The cowboy didn't argue. He just threw another log on the fire. His silence was its own kind of answer. It said, "You are worth this fire. You are worth this roof." The preacher came again later that week. He brought more food, and he brought his Bible. His prayers were a shield against the town's cruelty. "Preacher," the girl asked him, "is it wrong we're here? Folks say it's a shame." The preacher's eyes were sad. "Child, shame belongs to those who harm, not those who suffer. You remember that. But whispers have a way of getting under your skin." Every trip to town was worse. Men at the saloon would spit on the ground as he passed. Women would pull their children away as if he were carrying a plague. One day the girl came running back to the cabin, her face streaked with tears. "They said Mama's wicked," she sobbed, burying her face in his coat. "They said we don't belong." He held her tight. "You belong," he said, his voice like thunder, "right here. It don't matter what they say." But the mother heard, and she turned her face to the wall. She couldn't bear to see her child hurting because of her. That night, as snow began to fall, the girl whispered into the darkness, "Why won't they leave us be?" The cowboy was whittling again, the firelight catching the blade of his knife. "Because kindness unsettles folks who ain't found it in themselves," he said, "but will outlast their tongues." The mother listened, her heart torn between hope and despair. As the preacher was leaving, he paused in the doorway. "Hold fast," he told the cowboy. "Storms come and go, but souls are tempered in the fire." When he was gone, the cowboy pressed the finished whittling into the girl's hand. It was a small bird, its wings spread wide as if it were about to take flight. "Even the sparrows got a place in God's house," he said. She curled her fingers around it, clutching the small wooden promise. But what they didn't know was that the storm was already here. Outside, just beyond the reach of the firelight, a group of men had gathered. They carried lanterns and something else, something that looked a lot like rope. The whispers were done, and the real trouble was about to begin. The storm hit without warning. One minute, the snow was falling soft and quiet. The next, the wind was screaming like a banshee, throwing snow against the cabin walls so hard it sounded like rocks. Inside, the fear was so thick you could taste it. The twins were crying, a high, thin wail of hunger and cold. The girl was trying to soothe them, but her own tears were running down her face. The mother lay on the bed, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. "I've cursed you all," she whispered, her eyes full of a terrible shame. The cowboy knelt beside her. "Ain't no curse here," he said, his voice steady. "Trouble finds all of us. What matters is what we do with it." But he knew they were in real trouble. The firewood was almost gone. The milk was running out. He had to go to town. "Don't go," the girl cried, grabbing his sleeve. "Please don't go." He put his hand over hers. "I'll come back. You got my word. A man don't break his word." He pulled on his coat, pulled his hat down low, and stepped out into the blizzard. It was like stepping into another world, a world of white, roaring fury. The wind cut at his face like 1,000 tiny knives. The snow was so deep his horse could barely move. But he pushed on. When he finally stumbled into the general store, the men gathered around the stove all turned to look at him. Their eyes were cold and hard. "Come for more charity, have you?" one of them sneered. The cowboy's voice was hoarse from the cold. "I've come for what keeps children alive." The shopkeeper hesitated. You could see the conflict on his face. Then, from the back of the store, the preacher's voice cut through the tension. Let him be. If a man brings home food for babes, the Lord calls it righteous. They gave him the supplies, but their silence was a judgment. He turned and walked back out into the storm. The ride back was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the precious supplies from his frozen hands. More than once, he thought he was going to die out there, buried in a nameless snowdrift. But then he would think of the girl's face. He would hear the cries of the twins, and he would keep going. He was half dead when he finally saw the faint glow of the cabin light through the swirling snow. He stumbled through the door and collapsed on the floor, the jug of milk still clutched in his arms. The girl ran to him, throwing her small arms around his neck. Her tears were hot on his frozen skin. No man should weep in front of children, he said, his voice breaking. But reckon tonight I can't help it. The mother had pushed herself up on one elbow. She looked at him, covered in snow, shaking with cold. But there, he was there, and in that moment the walls she had built around her heart came crashing down. You came back, she whispered. He managed to nod. Told you I would. It was in that moment that they became a family, not by blood, not by name, but by a promise kept in the middle of a storm. The cowboy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. A little wooden horse, whittled so long ago the wood was smooth as stone. He pressed it into the girl's hand. Was meant for another, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But reckon it belongs to you now. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he wasn't a stranger anymore. He was safety. He was home. The mother watched them, and she began to sob. Not from pain or from shame, but from a hope so fierce it hurt. She reached out a trembling hand toward him. Maybe, she whispered, maybe God ain't done with me yet. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. But through the howling of the wind they could hear it. Shouting, the sound of men's voices, angry and determined. The lanterns were getting closer. The town had come to deliver its judgment, and they had brought the fire and the rope to do it. The pounding on the door was like a death knell. Open up in there, a voice roared, rough and ugly. The cowboy was on his feet in an instant. He moved the woman and children to the back corner of the cabin, away from the door. Stay down, he whispered, his voice calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He drew his revolver. The click of the hammer being pulled back was loud in the sudden silence of the cabin. Who's out there? He called. It's the law drifter, Sheriff Brody. We got a complaint. The cowboy knew this wasn't about a complaint. This was a reckoning. What kind of complaint requires a dozen men in the middle of a blizzard? He asked. The sheriff's voice was smug. Complaint about a man harboring a woman of low character, a woman who ran out on her responsibilities. A lie, a clean, simple lie to cover up a dirty truth. The mother let out a small, broken sob. She ain't hurting no one, the cowboy said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. She's sick, and these children are hungry. Those children, another voice cut in, this one colder, sharper, don't belong to her. They belong to their father, a respectable man. The cowboy felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He knew that voice. It was the voice of Silas Blackwood, the richest, most powerful rancher in the county. The man who owned this town, body and soul. And suddenly it all made sense. The whispers, the judgment, the fear in the woman's eyes. This wasn't about morality. It was about power. What do you want, Blackwood? The cowboy asked. I want what's mine, Blackwood said. My son's children. He made a mistake with that woman. I'm here to clean it up. So that was it. The twins. They were the sons of Jebediah Blackwood, a man known for his cruelty and his appetites. And Silas Blackwood was here to erase the evidence of his son's sin. You'll have to come through me first, the cowboy said. There was a moment of silence. Then Blackwood laughed, a cold, empty sound. That can be arranged, he said, and then the first shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door right next to the cowboy's head. The siege had begun. The cabin was a trap. Shots came from all sides, shattering the small window, tearing holes in the thin wooden walls. The cowboy returned fire, but he was one man against a dozen. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. He looked over at the woman. She was huddled on the floor, shielding the twins with her own body, the little girl pressed against her side. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a cold, hard fury. "There's a loose board under the bed," she said, her voice steady. "It leads to a crawl space. You can get out through the back." He shook his head. "I ain't leaving you." "You have to," she said. "Take the children, get them away from here. They can't have them. You can't let them have them." He looked at the girl, her face pale with terror, clutching the little wooden bird he had given her. He looked at the infants, so small, so helpless, and he knew she was right. His life didn't matter. Theirs did. He waited for a lull in the shooting, then moved fast. He pulled up the board. The crawl space was dark and narrow, but it was a way out. He turned to the woman. "I'll come back for you," he promised. She gave him a sad, beautiful smile. "I know," she said. "Now go." He took one of the twins, and the girl took the other. They crawled into the darkness, the sound of the gunshots echoing behind them. As they slipped out into the blizzard, the cowboy looked back one last time. He saw the cabin door burst open. He saw Silas Blackwood's men pour inside, and then he heard a single, final gunshot. He closed his eyes, a silent scream tearing through him. But he couldn't stop. He had another promise to keep. He had to get the children to safety. He ran, the snow and the wind and the darkness swallowing him whole. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. He finally stumbled into a small hidden ravine, sheltered from the worst of the wind. He collapsed in the snow, the baby held tight against his chest. The girl huddled beside him, her small body shaking with cold and grief. Is Mama?" She couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how to answer her. He just pulled her close, trying to shield her from the storm, from the world, from the truth. They stayed there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the wind howl. Just when he thought they were going to freeze to death, he saw a light. A single lantern bobbing in the distance. His first instinct was to hide. It had to be Blackwood's men. But the light was coming closer, and then he heard a voice. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" It was the preacher. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in the cowboy's chest. He staggered to his feet, the baby in his arms, and stumbled toward the light. The preacher saw them, and his face was a mask of horror and relief. He helped them back to the church, to the warmth, to a fragile, temporary safety. He told them what had happened. After the cowboy and the children had escaped, Blackwood's men had set fire to the cabin. They had told the town that the woman had died in the fire, a tragic accident. But the preacher knew the truth, and he had made a choice. He could no longer stand by and let evil win. "Silas Blackwood owns this town," the preacher said, his voice grim. "He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. There's no law here but his." The cowboy looked at the two sleeping infants, at the little girl who had lost everything. "Then we'll make our own law," he said. They weren't just running anymore. They were hunting. They holed up in the church for 2 days, waiting for the storm to pass. The preacher had a small stockpile of food, and the church was warm. The children were safe, for now. The girl was quiet. The light had gone out of her eyes. She just held her baby brother and stared into space. The cowboy's heart broke for her every time he looked at her. He knew he had to do something, not just for her, but for her mother. He had to make Blackwood pay. But how? Blackwood had an army of hired guns. The cowboy was just one man. "You can't fight him head on," the preacher said, reading his thoughts. "You'll die." "I ain't afraid of dying," the cowboy said. "I'm afraid of letting him get away with it." "There's another way," the preacher said. He went to a small, locked chest hidden behind the altar. He opened it and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to the town's last doctor," he said. "The one before Blackwood brought in his own man." He opened the journal. The doctor kept records of everything: births, deaths, injuries. He was a good man, an honest man. He flipped through the pages, and he knew Silas Blackwood's secrets. The cowboy leaned closer. The journal was a ledger of Blackwood's sins. Stories of men who had crossed him and ended up dead. Stories of land deals sealed with threats and violence. And then they found it, an entry from 7 years ago. The doctor had been called out to the Blackwood ranch to treat the cowboy's wife. She was in labor, and there were complications. The doctor wrote that Silas Blackwood had refused to let him take her into town. He had insisted the baby be born on the ranch, and he had provided the doctor with a bottle of whiskey, a very old, very expensive bottle of whiskey. The doctor's handwriting got sloppier as the entry went on. He wrote that he had been drunk, that he had made a mistake, that the baby had died, and the mother had died with him. The cowboy stared at the page, the words blurring through a sudden haze of tears. It hadn't been an accident. It had been murder. Blackwood had killed his family, and now the cowboy knew why. His ranch, the one he had sold for next to nothing after his wife died, the one he couldn't bear to look at anymore. It had the only year-round source of water in the entire valley, and it was right next to Blackwood's land. Blackwood hadn't just wanted the water, he had wanted it all. The rage that filled the cowboy was a pure, white-hot thing. It burned away his grief. It burned away his fear. All that was left was the need for justice. "He won't get away with it," the cowboy whispered. "I'll see him in hell first." The preacher put a hand on his shoulder. "The Lord says, 'Vengeance is mine.'" The cowboy looked at him, his eyes burning. "The Lord can have him when I'm done with him." He had the proof. Now he just needed a plan. And he had one. It was simple, it was brutal, and it was going to end in blood. He was going to burn Silas Blackwood's world to the ground. The plan was to hit Blackwood where he lived, not his house, his legacy. The preacher had told him that Blackwood was expecting a big cattle buyer from back east. This deal was going to make him the most powerful man in the state. The deal was being signed at the saloon, the only place in town big enough for a man of Blackwood's ego. And that's where the cowboy would make his stand. He left the children with the preacher. He hugged the little girl tight. "You be brave," he said. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the fire, there was a flicker of light in her eyes. "You be brave too," she whispered, and she pressed the little wooden bird into his hand. He walked out of the church and into the cold, bright sunlight. He didn't ride his horse, he walked. He wanted them to see him coming. He walked down the middle of the main street, the doctor's journal tucked into his coat. People saw him and scattered, running into their houses, bolting their doors. They knew what was coming. When he got to the saloon, Blackwood's men were waiting for him. There were 6 of them, hard men with cold eyes. "That's far enough, Drifter," one of them said. The cowboy didn't stop. He just kept walking. "I've got business with your boss," he said. They drew their guns. He drew his. It was over in seconds. The cowboy was a whirlwind of motion, his gun barking, spitting fire and death. When the smoke cleared, 6 men were lying dead in the street, and the cowboy hadn't even been scratched. He kicked open the saloon doors and stepped inside. The place was crowded. Silas Blackwood was at a table in the back with a fancy-looking man in a suit. The whole room went silent. Blackwood looked up, and his face went pale. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. The cowboy walked toward him, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He threw the doctor's journal on the table. "The meaning of this," he said, his voice cold and deadly, "is that your time is up." Blackwood looked at the journal, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. But then he laughed. "That book means nothing. It's the word of a dead drunk against mine." "It ain't just his word," the cowboy said. "It's hers too." He pulled the little wooden bird from his pocket and set it on the journal. "You took my family from me," he said. "You took that little girl's mother. You tried to take her children." He drew his gun and leveled it at Blackwood's heart. "Now I'm going to take everything from you." The cattle buyer stood up, his face white. I think I should be going." "You sit down," the cowboy said, not taking his eyes off Blackwood. He looked around the room, at the faces of the townspeople, the ones who had whispered and judged, the ones who had been too afraid to stand up. "You all know who this man is," he said. "You've lived under his thumb for years. You've let him get away with murder." He looked back at Blackwood. "It ends today. Right here. Right now." Blackwood's hand was inching toward the gun under his coat. "You're a fool," Blackwood sneered. "You think you can change anything. I own this town." "You don't own me," the cowboy said. And then the saloon doors opened again, and the preacher walked in. He wasn't alone. Behind him were a dozen men from the town, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths. They were all holding rifles, and they were all looking at Silas Blackwood. "It's over, Silas," the preacher said. "The town has made its choice." Blackwood looked at the faces of the men he had terrorized for so long, and for the first time he saw not fear, but courage. His empire was crumbling around him. He let out a roar of rage and drew his gun. But he was too slow. The cowboy's gun flashed once, and Silas Blackwood fell back in his chair, a look of surprise on his face, a small dark hole in his heart. Silence. Then the townspeople started talking all at once, a flood of relief and gratitude. The cowboy didn't stay to hear it. He turned and walked out of the saloon, back into the sunlight. He walked back to the church. When the little girl saw him, she ran to him, laughing and crying at the same time. He knelt and swept her up into his arms. He had done it. He had kept his promise. Justice had been served. The town was free, and a new family had been born from the ashes of the old one. A family made not of blood, but of courage and sacrifice and love. A cowboy, a preacher, a little girl, and 2 baby boys. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would walk it together. If you were moved by this story of redemption and justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the heart of the Old West. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Thank you for being part of our community.